Welcome. Circle next Tuesday in red, the 22nd of January. That's the day the United States Senate could decide whether to return from the dead by reforming the filibuster and allowing democracy to work. Once upon a time, the filibuster enabled a clique of senators, or even just one, to stall progress by prolonged speaking. Emphasis on speaking. You had to show up in person if you were a senator and hold the floor continuously by not shutting up until you dropped. That's what happened when Mr. Smith went to Washington.
Half of official Washington is here to see democracy's finest show, the filibuster. The right to talk your head off. The American privilege of free speech in its most dramatic form.
Well, I'm not licked. And I'm going to stay right here and fight for this lost cause. Even if this room gets filled with lies like these. And the tailors and all their armies come marching into this place. Somebody will listen to me.
No longer. The rules were changed in 1975, and these days, that one senator, or a clique of them, can bring the entire Senate to its knees without being there in person or saying a word. While our founding fathers believed in checks and balances, they feared that kind of obstructionism. Alexander Hamilton, the handsome, conservative man on our $10 bill, argued against anything like it. The purpose would be, he wrote, to embarrass the administration, to destroy the energy of the government, and to substitute the pleasure, caprice, or artifices of an insignificant, turbulent, or corrupt junta to the regular deliberations and decisions of a respectable majority. That's just what the Republicans have been doing. Since 2007, when they lost the majority in the Senate, they've mounted or threatened to mount nearly 400 filibusters, blocking everything from equal pay for equal work and jobs bills to immigration reform and judicial appointments. As a result, there are more vacancies on the federal courts today than when President Obama first took office. But hold on. When Democrats were in the minority in the Senate and threatening to filibuster against George W. Bush's judicial nominees, their leader, Harry Reid, had some kind things to say about the tactic.
The filibuster serves as a check on power and preserves our limited government. Right now, the only check on President Bush is the Democrats' ability to voice their concern in this body, the Senate. If Republicans roll back our rights in this chamber, there will be no check on their power. The radical right wing will be free to pursue any agenda they want.
Now the shoe's on the other foot, and so I asked Larry Cohen to explain the double standard. He's president of CWA, the Communications Workers of America, 700,000 workers in many industries, including media, telephone and data services, and health care. But that's just his day job. Larry Cohen's also a leader of the Democracy Initiative, a coalition of progressive organizations as varied as the NAACP, Common Cause, the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, Jobs with Justice, and the AFL-CIO. Along with an affiliated campaign called Fix the Senate Now, they're campaigning hard to change the filibuster rules. Take a look at their ad.
As climate change threatens the world we leave to our children and good U.S. jobs move overseas, time in the Senate ticks by. As women earn less than men for the same jobs, time in the Senate ticks by. It keeps ticking by with no results because the system is broken. But we can fix it and make the Senate work for us again if our senators vote to end the silent filibuster and for common sense reforms.
They have only hours to do so. Unless the Senate reforms the filibuster on Tuesday, the minority wrecking crew remains in charge for the next 2 years. Larry Cohen, welcome.
Great being with you.
If the Democrats were back in the minority, would you be making this fight to reform the filibuster that you're making now?
Absolutely, because we believe that what a democracy means is that the American people are entitled to get discussion, debate, and eventually a vote on the critical questions of the day. And we haven't had that in decades in the U.S. Senate. Everything dies there. It doesn't get discussed and debated there, as people used to believe. We need to bring back the debate in the U.S. Senate.
But if the Republicans became the majority again, they might deny you the very thing you want.
That means Democrats who are in the minority would have to stand up, talk, and fight back.
Talk.
Talk. Really radical idea. Talk, talk, talk. Yes.
And that's eliminated now in the Senate.
There's no discussion of these issues unless you have 60 votes for the proposition.
Because it takes 60 members of the Senate to vote to continue the discussion.
It takes 60 just to put the bill on the floor right now.
Isn't there a double standard? The party that's in the majority wants to reform the filibuster until it winds up in the minority.
I think there is to some extent a double standard, but I think, we the people need to stick on the path of we want the democracy no matter what. That playing defense in that way is limited. But more importantly, the Senate Resolution 4, which is what will be discussed in the caucus next Tuesday before it comes to the Senate floor, would maintain, in fact, it would strengthen the filibuster. It would actually say, filibuster, good, you'll have to talk. Both sides will have to talk because the majority would have to talk as well. So what we're really talking about here is not eliminating rights of the minority. We're talking about getting the issues on the floor of the U.S. Senate starting next week.
The 112th Congress just ground to a halt. Absolutely nothing done. The worst record in recorded history. How did we get into this fix?
Well, starting in the 70s, it got worse and worse and worse. So it used to be the filibuster was rare, very, very rare. So in Lyndon Johnson's tenure as majority leader, which ended when he was vice president in January of '61, there was one filibuster in his 6 years. In Harry Reid's 6 years, almost 400. That's the contrast. It's gradual. The right to filibuster has been there, since the modern Senate was there. But it's the perversion of senators that are willing to filibuster anything, any single thing. They bring this to bear.
Describe that perversion.
That perversion is everything from the almost 100 judicial vacancies that you talked about to many examples of recess appointments in the executive branch. We just spent $3 billion on a presidential election, and the president's appointees, most of them that he makes now, are unlikely to ever get confirmed, unlikely to ever get debated, unlikely to ever get discussed, and certainly unlikely to ever serve.
Your ad talks about ending the silent filibuster.
Right.
What's behind that?
Senate Resolution 4, authored by Jeff Merkley from Oregon, would actually make it essential that people talk. It would encourage, this is what the American people want, it would encourage debate. It wouldn't push it away.
What is your reform asking for, demanding next Tuesday?
Yeah, 4 things. 1, that the majority leader of the Senate can put a bill on the floor for discussion and debate. Right now, he can't do that unless he has 60 votes to do it.
Number 2.
He can't even proceed. Number 2, nominations. The executive branch, the president, makes nominations. There needs to be a clear way for those nominations to get discussed in a short period of time, not 30 hours of Senate time, which is more than a week, but in a short period of time, they get discussed and they get a vote on nominations. Number 3, a conference committee. The House passes one bill, the Senate passes another bill. What's supposed to happen is there's a conference committee, and they sort it out, and they bring the bill back, and then it's adopted by both houses. And then the biggest issue is the talking filibuster. That's number 4. That once the majority leader puts a bill on the floor, which you would now be able to do, puts the bill on the floor, there has to be 41 senators present that object to prevent the bill from moving forward. If they do object, they then have to speak. They have to hold the floor. And yes, the minority can still stop a vote, but they will have to show up and they will have to speak out. Right now, you don't even know who is filibustering. Not only do they not have to talk, they call their cloakroom and they say, I object.
If they're bringing the Senate to its knees, you want them to do it visibly. You want to be able to look at them on C-SPAN and from the gallery and see who is holding the Senate up.
Exactly. Who's holding it up and what do they have to say? And what does the debate sound like? That's what we want. We want a Senate that debates, not a Senate that hides.
You've said in other places the Senate is broken, but is it more broken than it is held hostage?
We would say broken because lots of energy goes into electing these senators individually, and then the results are almost nothing. So that's why we would say broken. You could definitely say it's held hostage, but we would say broken because I think regardless of how the deck stacks up, Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, it should not function this way. I mean, we really do believe that. We think our members and working people in this country, and most Americans would say it's fair. People get elected. At some point, the majority should rule. And that's the way it is in every other democracy in the world.
But as we talk, what's up with Harry Reid? He does seem to be backing away from the strong reform that you propose. I brought a story from TalkingPointsMemo.com. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is voicing support for a set of changes to the current filibuster rules that would fall far short of the more sweeping proposals from people like Mr. Cohen. What's up?
Well, I think part of what's up is he's got 4 or 5 Democrats, many of them senior, in his own party who don't want to see this. And they're, in fact, at this moment, trying to make their own deal with people like John McCain for next to nothing from our point of view. You wouldn't see any of those 4 changes that we're pushing for. And I think he is reluctant, unfortunately, to go ahead with the overwhelming majority of Democrats that he has. He's got 51 Democrats
already
who will support Senate Resolution 4. And we need the American people to call in to Senator Reid and say, let's take a stand. Let's bring democracy to the U.S. Senate.
The polls suggest that the majority of Americans really want filibuster reform and want the talking filibuster.
Right. Overwhelming majority, 2/3 at least. And in fact, on the other side, like 7 or 8 or 9% say, oh yeah, they should be able to phone in from their fundraiser, which is what they do, and say, I object. And then you're in unanimous consent. And now to get out of unanimous consent, you need 60 votes to move forward. Very few Americans believe that's what they elected a senator to do.
So a senator could be sitting somewhere off Capitol Hill, raising money on the telephone, which they all spend hours every week doing, and there's a vote coming up or a bill being put forward. He can just call the cloakroom. She can call the cloakroom and say, I filibuster.
I object.
I object.
It's not really a filibuster because the filibuster would mean you'd be talking. So all they got in this case, they just say, I object. There's no unanimous consent, so they can quickly shift the burden to the majority party or some coalition of 60. And if there's not 60, that bill or item does not proceed. It could be a nomination. It doesn't even have to be legislation.
Pretend I'm Harry Reid. It's Monday afternoon after the inaugural speech. You're with him in his office in the Capitol. Look him in the eye and tell him what you want him to do.
You need to do what you said on the floor of the Senate last spring. We need real change. We don't get rid of the rights of the minority, but we need to make them talk. We need to get rid of the motion to proceed. We need to have a clear path on nominations, and we need to be able to name conferees. Our country, our nation is hungry for change and debate and discussion. We need that discussion. Please, Senator Reid, don't back off. Stick with the 51 senators who will be with you on that. If Senator McConnell was the majority leader, the rules would be changed far more than what we're talking about on the 22nd or even back on January 3rd when they met for a few hours. They would be in lockstep and they would change the rules so their agenda got passed. What we have to worry about is why aren't the Democratic senators as a whole, many of them are amazing people, but as a whole, ready to stand up for working Americans, working families in this country, for all Americans, and to stand up and talk and move this agenda forward.
And why aren't they?
I would say that they're conflicted about that kind of change, even though they run on it when they campaign.
There are some more responsive to corporate contributions than they are to your workers.
Yeah,
right?
far more responsive. Far more responsive. Yeah.
How do you change that?
Primaries. We have to have people, ready to run that respond to the broad, the state labor's in this country. They're not going to come from labor, but come from the progressive community, the same kinds of groups that are working together on the democracy front. Candidates like an Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts, who you don't have to think twice about, or Sherrod Brown in Ohio, and Tammy Baldwin. I mean, now I've only named a few. But, Merkley and Udall, who are champions of this, people who, despite the fundraising problem, which is gigantic, an open Senate seat can be $20 million. Well, where's $20 million going to come from? So this is why our democracy initiative is also on voting rights. We have the lowest registration in the world of any democracy, let alone then the turnout. And so, we're on voting rights, money in politics, and Senate rules. It's not just one thing. And we're going to need to build a real movement to bring about a 21st century democracy here.
Your coalition is called the Democracy Initiative. Who's funding your efforts?
At this point, everybody sort of funds it together. I mean, those ads, we're funding a lot of those ads, but it's voluntary.
We being labor.
Yeah, and CWA more than our share, because we believe that if we don't restore the democracy, the rest of the things that our members want aren't going to be there.
Let me read you from a column by the conservative Washington journalist Matthew Continetti. Quote, someone needs to give the members of the Democracy Initiative a tap on the shoulder, a kick in the pants, a wonk-like nudge, anything to wake them from their fantasy of being weak and isolated and besieged, anything to alert them to the fact that it is they, not the Scafes, Exxons, Coors, and Cokes of the world who actually run the country.
Huh, that sounds like things turned upside down to me. I don't know what he's talking about.
He's saying that progressive groups really are setting the agenda now, and that you have all this.
None of our members feel that way. Trust me, none. They feel like their standard of living is declining. Their jobs are sent anywhere in the world. Their health care is declining. Retirement security, Social Security, their pensions are destroyed. They don't feel like they're running the world.
You've been talking about this for some time now, talking about building a political and economic democracy movement, in effect to become, in one sense, what the Tea Party of the left. That is, to hold the Democrats accountable in the primaries for the core interest of their constituents. Even for labor to become more independent of the Democrats.
Labor itself will never change this country. In a fundamental way, labor has to work with the kinds of folks we talked about here, civil rights Greens, in a much more basic way than we have, at least in the last 80 years. It can't just be a nice addition. It's got to be like core, we're in this together. It's our common agenda. We're going to fight foreclosures as much as we're going to fight for bargaining rights. We're going to fight climate change as much as we're going to fight to raise the standard of living. And it's going to take that kind of a labor movement, and I think a lot of us are ready for that kind of a labor movement.
Last year, 2012, labor took a series of defeats right on the chin in Wisconsin and Michigan and other places. And I think you wrote recently that 88% of the workers in this country do not have collective bargaining rights, and the 12% who do are constantly fighting a defensive battle. How do you change that? Is labor dying?
I think the way we change that is that part of the agenda, the economic justice part, but the democracy part goes with it. But on the economic justice front, part of it is to get the partners, which they are now, the Greens, the civil rights, the students, the others, to say, we're never going to restore a decent economy here if working people have no rights. If people can't bargain with their employer, there's no place in the world where people who can't bargain raise their wages. In fact, they get wage cuts on a continuing basis. And so I think that our strategy is to link core issues together so that it's not just, quote, labor, or particularly organized labor. As you said, 12%, that includes the public sector. Private sector is under 7%. It's not just labor talking about workers' rights. It's all of us who have a vision of economic justice. Let's do something about economic inequality. Let's figure out how to stimulate the demand side of the economy, because you need rising wages to have rising demand to get the economy going again. I think it's that kind of an agenda. And, you know, in our view, what we talked to our members about, I was at a meeting in California of young news stewards on Saturday, is this is 7 to 10 years. And, you know, I've been doing this my whole life, and I may not be there at the end of that period, but I am sure, absolutely certain, that without that kind of a basic movement in this country, democracy and economic justice, not just the traditional union agenda, we don't have a chance. But on the other hand, with that kind of an agenda, I absolutely believe we can change this country, as President Obama talked about in 2008. You know, the change you can believe in, the change you'll work for.
What's President Obama done for labor in these last 4 years?
Well, I think he's tried to do quite a bit. I think in his heart, he definitely supports, you know, working families. You know, part of the outcome piece is what gets through the U.S. Congress. So he definitely supported health care bill much more like Speaker Pelosi's than what we ended up getting through the Senate Finance Committee onto the Senate floor and eventually adopted a year later. He definitely supported workers' rights legislation. He definitely supported much more aggressive moves to stop the foreclosures. He definitely supported climate change. So part of this is really, you know, we would love to see more active White House support for these democracy initiatives so that the change that I'm sure he still believes in had some reality to it instead of just, you know, on the back bench somewhere.
Did he fight hard enough? I don't want to put you on the spot. Yeah, I want to put you on the spot.
Put me on the spot.
I wonder why labor keeps rolling over for the Democrats and for the president.
Yeah, well, we're trying not to roll over, by the way, particularly on this, as you well know, because the Democrats are solely responsible next Tuesday on the Senate rules. It has nothing to do with the Republicans. They are solely responsible.
You're saying the Democrats can win this without the Republicans?
Yeah, they won't get any Republican support for this.
But
This is solely up to the Democrats.
So they've got the votes. How many votes do they have?
They have the 51 to do Senate Resolution 4. They just have to go and do it.
Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday. They can absolutely do it if they choose to. On the other hand, if they go with a rationale that says we want to have bipartisan support for this, we want to do it the old way where technically they would have 2/3 support to change the rules, then guess what? We're going to see next to nothing change, and 2 more years will go by, and none of these bills will ever get discussed or debated all over again, and we'll pretend to have a democracy that we don't have. But yeah, I mean, back to your question about rolling, you know, and we like to roll the union on rather than roll over. We would say that Democrats need to stand up across this country for this democracy in a way where we're willing to fight on the issues of the democracy. Senate rules is the easiest one of those because next Tuesday, 51 elected Democrats can change it. But we also have to take on these much harder fights. What happened to voting rights? Why are only 70% of Americans registered? Why was it a $6 billion election? We've got to take on the democracy issues.
So if 3 or 4 of the 51 Democrats who could win for you next Tuesday desert you, betray you, abandon you, what will you do?
Well, we only need 51, so 4 can go. Actually, 5 can go because Vice President Biden has said he supports these things. We'll see. So if you had 50 plus him, there you have the new rules for the next Congress.
But if you lose next Tuesday, you have, as you've already said, based upon the past, almost no chance of anything happening in Congress.
And we need to reset. We will know who's who, even though they won't publicize that, but we will know who's who. And we need to look at primaries. We need to look at saying, guess what? We're not going to get involved at all. None of the progressives. So if you have a Republican take over in that seat, that's the way it goes. We will fight it out in the primary. We can't roll over, to use your words. Strong words, I might add. We have to show that we can make a difference.
Are they inaccurate words?
No, I feel that way sometimes.
Time and again, corporate breaks get in because Democrats
Yeah.
voted them in. Time and again, legislation favorable to labor doesn't get in because corporate Democrats won't move it along.
That's right. And we don't call it out, and we don't call it out because people say, well, this is always worse. Well, at a certain point, you have to say, yeah, we know how that works. That's why we'll work inside the Democratic Party, not outside. We will work inside. And as you said, where's the Tea Party success come from? Not a new idea. It comes from working and running and fighting inside. We have to do the same thing. And we need the equivalent of a progressive caucus, as we have in the House, fighting to define progressive values and being willing to stand up and fight back, even in public ways, especially when you see something as bad as these Senate rules.
Larry Cohen, thank you very much for being with me.
My pleasure, my honor. Thank you.